The butter tarts were still warm. Lennox Hardy carried the white paper bag against his chest as he stepped out of the cab on Borden Street, the Toronto cold hitting him square across the face the way it always did in November, without warning, without apology. He hadn't told anyone he was coming back early. Not his assistant, not his brother, not even the doorman at his building. The only person he'd thought to call was the person he was now walking toward. And even that call he hadn't made, because after 3 years of knowing exactly where Imogen Chauvet would be on a Wednesday morning, calling ahead seemed beside the point. She would be at Chapter and Grounds. She would be on her second coffee, the good kind she kept behind the counter and only made for herself and people she trusted. She would have the radio on low. Some CBC morning program she half listened to while cataloging returns. And she would look up when the bell above the door rang, and her face would do that thing it always did. A half second of surprise, then recognition, then a warmth that started in her eyes and arrived at her mouth about 2 beats later, like an afterthought that was actually the whole sentence. Lennox had been in London for 6 weeks closing a deal that should have taken 3. He had walked out of the boardroom at 7 this morning, looked at the gray English sky, and booked the first direct flight back. He hadn't fully examined why. He had told himself it was exhaustion. He had told himself the remaining paperwork could be handled remotely, which was almost true. He had told himself he simply wanted to sleep in his own bed, which was entirely false. The bag swung against his arm as he rounded the corner. That was when he saw the sign. It was not a large sign. It was handwritten on cardstock taped to the inside of the front window, the letters in Imogen's slanted, hurried handwriting. The kind that always leaned right, as if every word was trying to get somewhere faster than the pen could manage. Everything must go, final week. Lennox stopped on the sidewalk. A woman pushing a stroller moved around him without comment. The November wind picked up and the cardstock shifted on its tape. He stood there for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, reading the same 4 words 3 times, as if the third reading might produce a different meaning. Then he pushed open the door. The bell rang. Imogen was crouched behind the counter, lifting a box of hardcovers, and she startled at the sound. She looked up. The box slipped. Not dramatically. It simply became too heavy for fingers that had stopped paying attention to what they were holding. It dropped to the floor with a dull thud, and a copy of The Stone Angel slid out across the floorboards and came to rest against the base of the counter. Imogen Chauvet stood up slowly. She was wearing a green Henley with a fraying collar that Lennox had seen her wear exactly 11 times since they'd known each other. She only wore it when she was doing something she considered real work, not the public-facing version. Her hair was pulled back with a pencil still through it. There was a smudge of dust on her left forearm from the boxes. She looked at him the way people look at things they weren't certain were real. "You're not supposed to be back until next Thursday," she said. The deal moved faster than expected. A beat of silence. She came around the counter and picked up The Stone Angel from the floor. With the care of someone who couldn't help it, who would always pick up a book before she picked up a conversation. "You came straight from the airport," she said. It wasn't a question. She was looking at the bag in his hand. "Stop it, Brodeurs." Something moved across her face then, too quick to name, but which had the texture of a person being caught in the middle of a decision they hadn't finished making. She looked at the paper bag, and for a second Lennox saw the Imogen of 2 years ago, the one who had shown up at his office on the worst morning of his professional life with those same white bags and sat with him until he remembered how to function. Then her phone rang from somewhere behind the counter. She went still. "You should get that," he said. "It can wait." "Imogen." She went back behind the counter and answered it, turning slightly away. Not fully, not in the deliberate way of someone hiding something, but in the unconscious way of someone who had made a habit of keeping one conversation from bleeding into another. He heard a man's voice before she lowered the volume. Warm, familiar. The tone of someone who called often enough that both parties had stopped noticing the frequency. Lennox set the butter tarts on the counter and looked around the shop. He had been inside Chapter and Grounds more times than he could count. He knew the arrangement of every shelf, the particular creak of the third floorboard from the door. The way the afternoon light came through the west window and turned the poetry spines gold for exactly 20-some minutes before the angle shifted. He knew these things not because he had been paying attention, but because the mind files away what the heart has quietly decided matters. The shop looked different today. Not emptied, not yet, but lighter. Gaps in the shelves where whole sections had been. The small reading nook in the back corner, always anchored by a green armchair, now held 3 flat-pack boxes and a roll of packing tape. On the hook near the back door, where Imogen's canvas tote had always hung, there was instead a gray wool coat that belonged to someone else. He could tell by the cut, by the size, by the simple fact that it didn't belong to a person who spent her days surrounded by books and chose a fraying green Henley for the work she considered real. He was still looking at the coat when Imogen hung up. "That was my business partner," she said. The phrase arrived in the room and did not sit easily. Lennox turned. "When did you get a business partner?" She crossed her arms, not defensively, but in the way of someone trying to hold several things in place at once. She looked at the counter, at the butter tarts still in their bag, at the middle distance somewhere between. "Halifax," she said. "There's a shop there, a space I've been watching for 2 years. Pierce, he found a location, he has the capital, and he reached out 6 weeks ago with a proposal." 6 weeks ago, the same week Lennox had flown to London. "Pierce Sutton," Lennox said, not a question. Imogen looked at him directly then. Yes. Pierce Sutton was not a name Lennox said aloud, without a particular kind of stillness descending on him. They had known each other since Dalhousie, had moved in the same circles for years after graduation, had done one joint project together that ended cleanly only because both of them had good lawyers and the restraint not to say what they actually thought of each other. Lennox had no specific evidence that Pierce Sutton was a dishonest person. He had only the memory of watching him operate, the way he positioned himself at the edge of other people's momentum, close enough to benefit, far enough to avoid blame. He had also, at a dinner party 3 years ago, watched Pierce spend most of an evening in conversation with Imogen, and he had spent that same evening finding reasons to stand on the other side of the room. "You were going to leave," Lennox said. Imogen didn't answer immediately. "I was planning to tell you when you got back." "You were planning to tell me in 11 days that you'd already decided." "I hadn't decided," she said carefully. "I was deciding." The verb tense was precise. He noticed it the way he noticed everything she chose, which was to say, completely. He pulled out the stool behind the counter, her stool, the one she'd had since the shop first opened, and sat down. He placed both palms flat on the counter. "Talk to me," he said. She exhaled and leaned against the shelf behind her. "Halifax is a real opportunity, Lennox. A partnership with capital, a space twice the size of this one, in exactly the neighborhood I wanted when I started here. The community is there. The readers are there. Then why does your face look like you're apologizing for something?" A pause, brief and careful. "Because I'm closing chapter and grounds," her voice dropped. "I built this. I know what it cost, and leaving it isn't. It's not something I take lightly." "Then what is it you're taking lightly?" She pushed off the shelf and moved toward the back window. He recognized the gesture. Imogen thought better when she was moving. She had told him once that she needed her hands to have something to do before her mouth could find the honest words. "When you left for London," she said, without turning, "I spent a week being extremely productive. Reorganized the inventory, responded to every overdue email, repainted the back storage room. And then on the 8th day I sat in that chair," she gestured toward the empty reading nook, "and I thought about how the first thing I do when something good happens is look for a way to tell you, and that the second thing I do, every time I catch the first instinct, is to say nothing." The shop was very quiet. A streetcar moved past outside. "And then Pierce's email arrived," she continued. "A real, concrete, tangible thing. Numbers, a floor plan, a timeline, and I thought maybe this is the version of moving forward where I actually move." Lennox stood up from the stool. He walked slowly along the counter in the way he moved when a meeting had just produced something that required him not to respond too quickly, because the fast response was always the wrong one. He stopped at the small wooden crate at the end of the counter, the one where Imogen kept books she meant to pass along. He'd seen it dozens of times. It was usually overflowing. Today it held 4 books and a rubber band. He picked up the top one. It was a copy of The Watch That Ends the Night by Hugh MacLennan. He had given it to her. Not recently. 6, maybe 7 years ago, when they were still learning the shape of each other's company, when Lennox still handed books to people the way other men handed out business cards, and when Imogen was still deciding whether he was someone worth trusting. He had written something inside. He remembered that. He had stood at his kitchen counter for a good 10 minutes trying to decide whether to scratch it out, and then had convinced himself it was illegible enough that it wouldn't matter. He opened the cover. His own handwriting looked back at him, not illegible at all. He had spent years believing that. The 2 lines he'd written were clear. In the center of the title page, "I think you'd understand, Jerome. I think you understand most things I don't say." He stood very still. When he looked up, Imogen was watching him from across the room. She had known, somehow, exactly which book he would lift. Or she had simply known he would reach for a book, and the rest was just probability. "I read it last month," she said, finally, 7 years late. He didn't speak. "I left a note in it," she paused, "for the giveaway box." He turned to the page she meant. He knew the page because Imogen always tucked her notes opposite the most important line in any book she pressed into someone's hands. He'd seen her do it for years. The note was 3 lines in her slanted handwriting. "Found in the giveaway box. Read it. It was given to me. I think you understand most things I don't say too. I should have said something before you left." He read it twice. Then once more slowly, "The way you read something when your body needs a moment to catch up with what your mind has already understood." He was still holding the book when the back door opened. Pierce Sutton stepped into the shop the way he always entered a room, with the unhurried confidence of someone who assumed his arrival was expected. He was carrying 2 coffees in paper cups. He stopped when he saw Lennox. The 3 of them occupied the space for a moment that stretched past its natural length. "Lennox," Pierce said, "didn't know you were back." Clearly. Imogen had moved to stand near the counter, positioned equidistant between them, and Lennox recognized the quality of her stillness. Not indecision, but the specific alertness of someone listening to every register of a silence. Pierce set the coffees down on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a person who wanted his hands free. "She tell you about Halifax?" She did. "Good opportunity. The Queen Street North location is exactly the right neighborhood for what she wants to build." He looked at Lennox with the direct, professionally pleasant manner that had always been his most effective mode. "I'm glad you're back, actually. I'd like you to hear the full proposal." Lennox held his gaze. "Is this a business partnership you're offering, or something else?" The question arrived cleanly, without aggression, not an accusation, a measurement. Pierce's expression shifted a degree. "Business, 50-50. Halifax location registered in whose name?" A pause, brief but present. "Joint holding." "Which holding company?" Another pause. "We hadn't formalized that part yet," Pierce said. "Lennox," Imogen's voice was quiet. He turned to look at her. She was watching him with an expression that wasn't quite familiar. Or rather, it was an expression he'd seen her direct at other people, never at him. He'd seen it when suppliers underestimated her, when landlords tried to reopen settled terms. It was not anger. It was something steadier than anger. "I know how to read a contract," she said. "I know you do." "Then let me do it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the butter tarts from the counter, reached back and set the Watch That Ends the Night on top of them, and said, simply, "I'll be at Sunnyside Grill." He walked out. Sunnyside Grill was 4 blocks east, on a street that still had the same hardware store and the same Vietnamese place it had always had, the kind of diner that existed in every neighborhood, with the good sense not to renovate. He and Imogen had found it in their 2nd year of knowing each other, on a Sunday when both of them were too stubborn to wait for a table anywhere with a line. The table near the window was open. Lennox sat. He ordered coffee. He did not touch it when it arrived. 24 minutes later, the door opened, and Imogen sat down across from him. They didn't speak immediately. The waitress, a woman named Bev who had been bringing them coffee for 2 years and understood when a table needed to be left to itself, refilled Lennox's cup and brought one for Imogen without being asked. He's not a bad person, Imogen said finally. I know. But the contract wasn't 50-50. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The Halifax location would have been registered under his holding company. My name would have been on the operating agreement, not the lease. Lennox said nothing. I didn't see it because I was looking for something else. She looked out the window. A door. A door from what? A long pause, the kind she only permitted herself in places that felt like solid ground beneath her. I've been in love with you for a long time, she said. I can't tell you exactly when it started. Maybe the year you came into the shop at 11 at night because you just read Sinclair Ross for the first time and needed to talk about it with someone who would understand, and I was apparently that person. Maybe before. But at some point it stopped being something I could set aside and got into everything. She paused. And you're always moving toward the next thing, Lennox. The next acquisition, the next build, the next deal. I never fit the shape of what you move toward. He was quiet for a moment. You think I came back from London early because the deal closed, he said. Didn't it? The deal closed 4 days ago. She looked at him. I was at Brodeurs at 7 this morning buying butter tarts, he said. Not because I wanted butter tarts. Because you like them, and I have been carrying some version of this conversation around for 2 years trying to find a way to start it, without destroying the thing that already existed. He stopped. Which is, I realize, exactly the same reason you were packing boxes to go to Halifax. Imogen let out a breath that sounded as though it had been held for much longer than this conversation. We are, she said carefully, both extraordinarily stupid. Yes. The right kind of silence settled between them, the kind with room in it. The shop, he said. You don't actually want to close it. She looked out at Borden Street through the diner window. No. Then, don't. The lease renewal is in February, and the building is going to. I bought the building. She turned back to him with the exact expression he expected. The one reserved for people who used money as a shortcut through a conversation that deserved more than that. Absolutely not. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering to be your landlord at the current assessed rate with a 10-year fixed term. He met her eyes, which is substantially better than what you'll get from the current owner, who is planning to sell the block to a development group next spring. A development group I happen to know because I introduced them to the neighborhood 2 years ago. She stared at him. I was going to tell you, he said. I kept looking for the right time. The silence that followed was different from all the others that morning. Imogen set down her mug, very slowly. You knew this whole time that Chapter and Grounds might lose its lease, she said. I knew there was a risk. And you said nothing. I was trying to find a way to solve it without. He stopped. He heard the shape of what he was saying and recognized it for what it was. Without you knowing it was me solving it, he finished, which was also, in retrospect, extremely stupid. Imogen laughed. Short, involuntary, and entirely real, the kind of laugh that escapes when pressure drops suddenly, when something that was complicated and tight reveals itself to be, against all odds, a little bit absurd. You were protecting the shop, she said, without telling me. Yes. And I was protecting myself from you. Yes. She shook her head slowly, and we almost ended up with neither. Bev came by with the pancakes neither of them had ordered. She set them down and moved away with the practiced discretion of someone who had seen this table go through things and had learned not to remark on it. They ate. They talked. The coffee went cold and was refilled and went cold again in the way of conversations that have years to recover. Lennox told her the note he'd written in the watch. That ends the night had taken him almost an hour to find the right words and 20 minutes to convince himself she'd never notice. Imogen told him she had noticed on the bus home the same day he gave it to her, had read it 3 times before her stop, and had spent the following years finding reasons it meant something other than what it meant. He told her he'd spent most of his adult life moving, because standing still had always felt to him indistinguishable from giving up. She told him she'd built Chapter and Grounds for the same reason, not only because she loved books, though she did, but because she'd needed proof that something she made with her own hands could last. By the time they walked back out onto Borden Street, The November light had dropped low and golden, the way it did on the good days in that city, the days that reminded you why you stayed when it would have been easier to go. Lennox stopped at the corner. Imogen stopped beside him. "The butter tarts are still in the shop," she said. "I know. They'll be cold by now. Butter tarts are fine cold." She looked at him, that half-second of surprise, then recognition, then warmth arriving exactly one beat late. "Come on then," she said. The following week, Imogen called Pierce Sutton and declined the Halifax partnership. She had a lawyer review the draft contract first and forwarded the relevant clause. The one about the lease registration, with a single line attached. "You should correct this before you offer it to anyone else." She did not hear back. Lennox finalized the purchase of the Borden Street building in December, handled at arm's length and at a fixed rate, and the only direct conversation he had with the previous owner concerned the development group and what they would need to find instead. Chapter and grounds did not close. Imogen repainted the front door over the holidays and put the green armchair back in the reading nook. She rehung the section signs in a different order, one she'd been considering for 2 years. She made a fresh giveaway box for January and put 4 books in it, all with notes tucked on the page opposite the most important line. One of them was The Watch That Ends the Night. She kept it on the counter for nearly a week before she decided it belonged back on the shelf in the Canadian literature section, where it had always been. 1 year later, on a Wednesday morning in November, the same month, almost the same light, Lennox came into Chapter and Grounds at 9 o'clock. He came from the direction of his own building, not the airport. He was carrying his camera, because the camera went everywhere with him, and a white paper bag from Broder's, because it was Wednesday and Imogen opened early on Wednesdays, and he had long since learned to plan around that. She was at the counter when he walked in. The bell above the door rang. She looked up and her face did that thing. Half a second of surprise, then recognition, then warmth arriving one beat later. "You're early," she said. Traffic was light. "There's coffee." "I know." He set the bag on the counter. "I can smell it." She smiled and went back to the invoice in front of her, and Lennox settled into the green armchair with his camera and a cup of the good coffee, the kind she only made for herself and people she trusted, and the November light came through the west window the way it always had, turning the poetry spines gold, and the shop filled with the sounds of a Wednesday morning opening up around them, and neither of them said anything more for a long while. They didn't need to. The right shape once found doesn't require announcing. Have you ever loved someone for years before you found the words? Leave your story in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.